Dr. Owen Brake with Appalachian Wellness. We're going to discuss the process of moving from addiction to recovery. This is a lengthy process. Time will take time, but it will be so worth it in the long run. The first part of this presentation pertains to the science behind the disease of addiction. The reader may wish to skip them or briefly skim over them. This in-depth review of the science of addiction was done to clearly describe that addiction is truly a disease in every sense of the word. We'll show that addiction is also truly a genetically transmitted disease and how you can adapt to a better life than you ever imagined with this condition.
U.S. prevalence of illicit drug use and abuse during 2015. There's a 41% incidence of any illicit drug use over somebody's lifetime in the United States. Admittedly, 41% can include one-time use of a substance, which is hardly addiction. There's an 8.5 incidence of any use of illicit drug in the past month, however. Monthly use is much more regular use than use in the past year or lifetime. This information is obtained from surveys. Survey data often underestimates actual use. Minimizing use is common among addicts. Minimizing is a form of denial. Considering the above, it's quite possible that up to 10% or more of the population may have a problem with substance abuse, excluding tobacco. A review of the table shows that alcohol abuse runs at about 14% of the population this past year. Looking at amphetamine, benzodiazepine, barbiturates abuse, cocaine abuse, 2% of the population in the past year, or almost 1% using it on a regular basis. Ecstasy is a drug that's not used quite as frequently. Hallucinogens are used almost as frequently, but they tend not to be as addicting. Heroin use is also noted to be a fairly significant number when one multiplies it out by the population of the United States. Inhalants include huffing, organic solvents such as gasoline, paint thinner, nail polish removal. It causes a lot of brain damage as well. Ketamine is a dissociative anesthetic used in veterinary and human medicine. It causes a fugue or trance-like state. Marijuana abuse, over the course of the lifetime, at least a quarter of the population admits to trying it, and over 10% of them have used it in the past year. Methamphetamine is a stimulant that is very easily manufactured. It's inexpensive. In the past year, 5% of the population has used it. In the past month, 2%. They're using it regularly. Opiates other than heroin, the pain pills, 4% in the past year of use. This is not the therapeutic use. This is abuse of this class of medication. In the past month, 0.1% of the population admits to abuse of this class of drug. Remember, this is not taken as directed. This is recreational or addictive abuse. When one considers the scale of the use of psychoactive substances currently in the United States, and considers that addiction is often characterized by the abuse of multiple substances, there is clear cause for concern. Generally, folks don't use only cocaine or only benzodiazepines or only opiates. They use all of these drugs in combination. Abuse of illicit substances costs the United States over $193 billion annually. Total substance abuse, including alcohol and tobacco, costs over $700 billion a year. These costs are attributed to time out of work, care for overdose and other problems, people harmed by those under the influence, property damage caused by those under the influence, and other factors. Addiction is a disease. Our biology programs us to seek pleasure. Addiction is a disease of self-will run riot. Spiritual and social growth and maturation teach us to look out for the needs of others. This inherent conflict between good for us versus good for others is a bit like good versus evil, that has plagued mankind since Adam and Eve. Addiction involves multiple human domains. Biology, medicine, of course, is the art of applied biology. Psychology, sociology, spirituality, together they form the biopsychosocial spiritual, or BPSS, approach to the disease of addiction. Addiction can happen in many forms. Substances such as alcohol, drugs, food, behaviors, gambling, love and codependence, sex. The American Society for Addiction Medicine, ASAM, points that genetics contribute 50% to this chronic brain disease. Genes load the gun, and environmental exposure or using pulls the trigger. Nobody can choose their genetic makeup. We couldn't pick better parents and genes. Addiction treatment provides education that helps people to understand and accept their genetic predisposition. Recovery consists of recognizing and understanding one's genetic vulnerability and adapting their life to grow beyond the constraints of this disease. Homeostasis is the term used to refer to the tendency toward a relatively stable equilibrium between interdependent elements, especially as maintained by physiologic processes. If something happens in one area, a corresponding change to balance the new system will happen elsewhere. Everyone has their own unique normal balance. Communication is essential to health. Our brain is constantly communicating externally with the senses of sight, smell, taste, hearing, touch, voice. Internally, our brain communicates through nerve cells called neurons that connect different areas of the brain to one another. Brain biology, how the nerves in the brain works. Neurons have their own components. Dendrites receive information from other neurons. Axons transmit information to other neurons. Usually the cell body, or soma, will be located midway between the axon and the dendrite, although not always. And the soma, cell body, contains all the metabolic machinery for the nerve, the nucleus, and the assorted intracellular organelles. The action potential is a term used to describe the electrical transmission down the nerve. It's a brief reversal of the normal internal negative voltage of the cell created by the passage of sodium ions into the cell. The synapse is a tiny gap separating neurons. Chemical neurotransmitters cross that gap to communicate to the next neuron. These neurotransmitters are stored in vesicles at the tip of the axon. An action potential, or electrical depolarization reversal of normal negative internal voltage, propagates along the neuron, triggering the release of neurotransmitters into the synapse of the vesicle. This action potential moves down the axon in a wave-like manner, with depolarization happening, and then immediately behind that, repolarization to restore the normal voltage to the cell. New neurotransmitters are released into the synapse from the axon. From this, a variety of possibilities will ensue. Receptors are present for each different type of neurotransmitter on the end of the next neuron, the dendrite of the next neuron. There are systems also in place to recover or reuptake and recycle these neurotransmitters. The neurotransmitter drug recovery system happens on both sides, presynaptic and postsynaptic of the vesicle. Drugs can have different effects. They can mimic a neurotransmitter as an agonist. They can block a neurotransmitter as an antagonist by occupying the receptor without causing the expected effect. This means that the proper neurotransmitter cannot occupy the receptor and trigger its normal function. The link at the top of this slide will give a very clear video demonstration of how all of this works. Sometimes the neurotransmitter receptors can be sped up, shortening the length of the neurotransmitter effect. Other times they can be slowed down, lengthening the effect of the neurotransmitter. Binding is rarely, if ever, permanent. Affinity measures the strength of the neurotransmitter drug to receptor binding. High affinity means the bond is stronger and will last longer. This is not to be confused with half-life in the body, which is a different concept completely. This is generally determined by the absorption through the gut for swallowed drugs or through the mucosa of the lungs, nose for smoked and snorted drugs, etc., into the bloodstream. Distribution happens throughout the body through the bloodstream, and some drugs such as marijuana will be stored in fatty tissues. The rate of metabolism or chemical breakdown, decomposition of the drugs, usually this occurs in the liver, but not always. Sometimes other organs can also have a role in this. Biotransformation to other metabolites may also occur. Sometimes these other metabolites may or may not have metabolic biologic activity on other parts of the body where there are other receptors. Excretion usually happens through the kidneys, sometimes through stool, breathing, or sweat. So ADME, absorption, distribution, metabolism, excretion. This is the ADME of pharmacology. If you ever hear that term used, you'll know what is being talked about. Receptors can have different effects. They might trigger another action potential to depolarize, trigger the next neuron to send another action potential down its axon. They may open channels on the cell membrane locally and allow hyperpolarization and reduce the possibility of another action potential forming. Often numerous axons from different neurons in different parts of the brain will connect to the given next neuron, and the end result will depend on the net effect on that next neuron. It's complicated. This is the basis of how we think, remember, act, and behave. Throw drugs into the mix, and the overall effect is even more complicated and unpredictable. Interacts with the genetics to influence the expression of our genes. Genotype is the term used to describe our genetic trait based on what genes we inherited from our parents. Allele is the term used to describe genotypic differences such as hair color, eye color, virtually everything else, including everything listed above. Phenotype is the result of the environmental interaction on our genetic trait. This is very complicated indeed. Nerve impulse transmission with multiple types of neurotransmitters is how thought and memory happen and all brain activity occurs. Drugs mimic neurotransmitters that are already present, generally in much lower concentrations, in the brain. Use of drugs can thus alter behavior, perception, emotions, feelings, thoughts, memory, etc. Our endocrine system uses hormones to communicate and regulate the rest of our body. There is a neuroendocrine link as well. The hypothalamus, neural brain link, produces neurotransmitters affecting the pituitary gland just beneath the hypothalamus. The pituitary is the master gland that regulates hormones all over the body. This affects not only the rest of the body, but the brain as well. The pituitary is the master gland of the endocrine system. It regulates every other gland in our endocrine system. Nerves work through these drugs and neurotransmitters to cause change. If you look at this chart, you'll see that every different drug available has one primary effect. It causes dopamine levels to increase. Secondary effects, some of them will affect alcohol, GABA, and glutamate, benzos and barbs, the same thing. So you can see that basically alcohol and benzos are alcohol in tablet form. Ecstasy affects serotonin. Marijuana contains endocannabinoids, which has effects in different parts of the brain. Nicotine affects acetylcholine. Opiates react with opiate receptors and the GABA receptors. Note that dopamine is the common denominator for all addictive substances and activities. Dopamine is also known as the feel-good neurotransmitter. Major anatomical structures in addiction. This is a picture of the brain. If you would take the brain and cut it right down the midline, separating the left half and the right half, we would be looking at where the slice was made, looking at the right half of the brain. Down here would be the spinal cord coming up to the medulla oblongata, or oblong body. From there to the pons, which has directive links to the cerebellum. Right here would be the locus coeruleus. These are all different important parts of the brain that will be dealt with in addiction. This area right here is the midbrain. Now, if you stop and take a look at the evolution of the brain, alligators and very primitive beasts will have basically a swelling at the end of the spinal cord, and that's about the entire extent of their brain. Through the course of time and evolution, the brain has evolved in a forward and upward direction. There's a shelf of bone underneath where the pointer is right here. And as it evolved forward, it also kind of swept a little bit backwards, sort of like in a figure S shape. If you look at it this way, you can get a better handle on how the brain evolved over time from primitive creatures that stopped about right here. And as you get progressively more complex into the animal tree, so to speak, human beings, will have the cerebral cortex that's very, very enlarged. Smaller, more primitive species, less evolved species will not have this large of a cerebral cortex. The ventral tegmental area is right in here. The hippocampus right there. The amygdala is the center of emotions. Mesocortical projections. Meso basically means middle, or from the very central portion of the brain. Cortical means up to the cerebral cortex. Hypothalamus is located right here. It's beneath the pituitary gland, the master gland of the body that controls all hormone activity, which would be right about here. Moving further forward and evolutionarily more involved, you get the nucleus accumbens. From there, we get up to the frontal cortex, the prefrontal area, which controls, among other things, impulsivity and judgment. The rest of the body, the rest of the brain, the corpus callosum is a series of lateral projections that connect the right and left hemispheres. The limbic center is part of the emotional center. It's down, projected through the amygdala area as well. The cerebellum is where all of our basic motor coordination and other functions take place, and we'll get into more of that through the rest of this discourse. As we review the neighborhood to kind of understand our terms, let's discuss a few anatomical terms. Superior means to the top or above. Inferior means toward the bottom or below. Anterior to the front, where the face would be. Posterior to the rear, the back of the head. Medial would be middle, toward the midline. Lateral would be off to the side, either right, left, or both. The brain evolved, as I mentioned, from a swelling at the superior top part of the spinal cord into the primitive hindbrain region. With further development, the brain would occur in the anterior superior manner that I described earlier. Folding would become necessary to fit it within the bony confines of the skull. Later in the developmental process, evolutionary, over eons of time, the cerebral cortex, or cortices left and right, would branch out to the sides. The medulla oblongata is the middle oblong, the enlargement at the top of the spinal cord. It controls cardiac, respiratory, vomiting, vasomotor, or blood pressure centers. It's basically concerned with the autonomic nervous system and functions of breathing, heart rate, and blood pressure. Pons, the word means bridge in Latin. Its major functions are sleep, respiration, breathing, swallowing, bladder control, hearing, equilibrium, taste, eye movement, posture, facial expressions, and facial sensation. It connects to the cerebellum for motor coordination and other functions. The locus coeruleus is between the pons and the cerebellum. There are many changes in this part of the brain that happen with those prone to addiction. These changes are passed along genetically. The midbrain is a relatively new part of the brain, developed over the past 250 million years, that's new, after the appearance of the hindbrain, which preceded it. The midbrain includes the emotional and behavioral centers, the limbic system composed of the amygdala and hippocampi. They are on both sides of the brain. The functions of the midbrain: vision, hearing, motor control, sleep, wake, arousal, alertness, and temperature regulation. The diencephalon, or forebrain, it's up toward the top of that S curve that we talked about and below the corpus callosum. This is still considered somewhat primitive brain because the cerebral cortex has not yet been reached. That's the home of the higher intelligent functions. The diencephalon contains the thalamus, which can be thought of as a router or switchboard where a lot of information passes through the thalamus to other parts of the brain. The hypothalamus, which connects to the pituitary, which controls all the endocrine system, hormones all over the body, and the basal ganglia, which are again part of the switchboard apparatus. They're located below and to the front of the forebrain. The basal ganglia and diencephalon in full control voluntary motor movements, procedural learning, things that we do like by hand tying our shoes. Routine behaviors or habits are formed in this part of the brain. Eye movements, cognition or thinking, and emotion. As you can see then, habits happen in a very primitive part of the brain, relatively speaking. So this is why you can teach cats, dogs, even reptiles to do certain little tricks at times. It doesn't require the higher brain functions to get into the habit of doing certain things on certain stimuli. Unfortunately, addiction is thus a very deeply rooted part of our behaviors and brain. The cerebellum at the back of the brain is a finely convoluted, much more than the cerebral cortex. Internally, if you section it, you will see what's called the arbor vitae, or tree of life. These are all different connections going from different processing areas in the cerebellum and keeping everything moving. The cerebral cortices, the top of the brain, developed about 200 million years ago. This is the newest part of the brain. Obviously, it seems like we're overdue for an upgrade. It's responsible for the higher cognitive functions, language, thinking, all related forms of information processing. Other important aspects of the brain: the cerebrospinal fluid surrounds the outside of the brain, acting as a cushion or shock absorber, providing nourishment to the brain. It also drains through the ends of the spinal nerves into the lymphatic system, which ultimately brings that fluid to the heart, where it's redistributed through the body and to the kidneys for excretion. Inside of the brain, there are hollow cavities called ventricles that are also filled with the cerebrospinal fluid. The spinal fluid is produced in these choroid plexuses that are located within the ventricles. The purpose of these big hollow ventricles filled with the fluid is to help absorb any mechanical forces and protect the brain from any real bad trauma. On the website, I have a PowerPoint presentation and also an outline of the addiction notes. And on those presentation and notes, I've got links to the addiction-related brain regions, function, neurotransmitter input, and projections that summarize the areas of the brain that are involved, what those areas typically do, the neurotransmitters that are active in those areas, what they receive input to, and where they project their output to, which different parts of the brain are involved. There is also a table of neurotransmitters and the drugs that affect them. This is really complex technical information that the average person probably doesn't want to know about, but for those that do, I spent the time to do the research and compile everything, and it helps you to understand and kind of pull it all together for those that are so inclined. So if you would like to look at that, the material has been put together for you. This is a picture of what the addicted brain looks like. You can see down here we have the spinal cord rising up the middle oblong, the medulla oblongata, the pons and the cerebellum, the midbrain, and then the diencephalon. The projections in addiction are very concentrated throughout the primitive central brain. They project out to the cortex in a variety of areas and also have projections that go to the cerebellum. There's a lot of concentration along the amygdala, the limbic system, the hypothalamus, nucleus accumbens, which would all be located in this area right here. The locus coeruleus would be in this part right here as well. This is information that will give you an idea of how complex the disease of addiction is and how much research has gone into it. The neural pathways involved in addiction are very interesting. They're very complicated. They also form in withdrawal. These circuits, prior pathways, can be thought of as circuits ready to be re-energized at a moment's notice. When folks relapse, they don't start with their addictive disease at the level of when they first became addicted. They typically relapse to a degree that was as great as or greater than what they were using when they had stopped using, even if it was decades ago. These neural circuits still exist. Think of a super high that was built, used for a while, and then for whatever reason falls into disuse. There may be very little traffic going on it, but there's many lanes available to carry a whole lot of traffic in the future should that become necessary. Addiction does change the brain structure and function. It causes impaired decision-making, impulsivity, especially in the prefrontal cortex, which has changes in addiction. This compulsivity in the prefrontal cortex causes changes leading to drug-seeking behaviors, cravings, habit formation, relapse triggers, stress dysregulation, and withdrawal, which happens more in the primitive brain areas. The prefrontal cortex can be thought of as a braking system for impulsivity and compulsivity. Addiction involves numerous structural changes in the brain, such as those with the dopamine 2 allele and the locus coeruleus and other areas of the brain, and those with addictive diseases. The mesolimbic system pathways are critical to the neurobiology of addiction. They're located in the brainstem, essential for our basic survival. The ventral tegmental area is located at the front of the mesolimbic center. The VTA projects to the nucleus accumbens, the reward center of the brain. The main mesolimbic neurotransmitter, dopamine, is the feel-good neurotransmitter. Dopamine is released when we engage in activities that help further our survival and the survival of the human species, which of course involves sex. This helps ensure our survival as a species. Things that happen in this part of the brain, this primitive part of the brain, feel that good. They really drive us forward. All addictive drugs and activities release dopamine into the nucleus accumbens. Stimulant-type drugs release more than other classes of drugs. Dopamine is associated with pleasure-seeking and drug-seeking craving activities. GABA and glutamate are also involved. These are other neurotransmitters involved in pleasure-seeking. They're more involved with alcohol and benzodiazepines. Dopamine is also involved in drug craving and dopamine deficiency with withdrawal. Natural cravings like food, water, and sex lessen with time and with satiation. When you've had enough, you've had enough. Dopamine activity increases with habituation. Once satisfied, those are enough. That's a natural craving. With addiction, it's another matter. This is an unnatural desire. Tolerance happens as people need to keep increasing the dose and frequency of their drug of choice to maintain the pleasurable effect of the amount of dopamine, which wears off after time and continued exposure to drugs. This amount of dopamine is higher than we can achieve normally without this excessive unnatural stimulation. So instead of having enough and being satiated, we become tolerant and we need more and more, higher doses more frequently. Tolerance drives the drug craving and compulsion to use, driving the addictive process forward. As addiction progresses, these cravings, compulsion, gradually replace the pleasure-seeking impulsive use. This is worsened with drugs such as opiates that have severe withdrawal symptoms in addition to craving. Craving as an attempt to avoid or relieve unpleasant symptoms. So addiction starts with pleasure seeking and ends up in a trap of using to relieve craving. Eventually, the relief of craving becomes its own form of pleasure. As drug use or addictive activity escalates, the involvement of various brain regions associated with our emotional state also increases. The brain region most often associated with our emotional state is the extended amygdala, part of the limbic system, where our emotional center live or is located. Interestingly, the olfactory bulb is located right next to the amygdala. Scents and smells often have a strong impact on our emotional state for this reason. Scientists think this brain region plays an important role in addiction because of its association with emotions and stress. The amygdala is involved in processing emotions and emotional memory. When the brain forms these memories, it stores the memory of the event along with the emotions that accompanied the memory. The memory of engaging in the addiction is stored with a pleasant emotional state, a positive emotional memory. Thus, the pleasing memories of engaging with an addiction can lead to the repeating these behaviors more and more often as the habit forms. Memory has another role in the development of addiction called cue anticipation. Cue anticipation refers to environmental cues that can initiate or elevate cravings. Cravings then often lead to relapse. This sort of thing could be thought of as an alcoholic who hears the sound of glass ice cubes clinking into a glass and liquor being poured over it will trigger their craving for a drink. For this reason, these cues are often called relapse triggers. These environmental cues or relapse triggers could be anything associated with the addiction. The brain may also form an association between unpleasant emotions and a memory, forming a bad or negative memory. This negative emotional memory of anxiety becomes associated with the physical signs of withdrawal. As withdrawal begins, the symptoms trigger an unpleasant emotional memory. This increases the negative experience of withdrawal, acting as a feed-forward or amplification loop within the neural circuitry. Withdrawal avoidance via returning to the addiction often becomes the cornerstone of addiction in the later stages. Thus, in the early stages of addiction, the pleasurable experience of the drug motivates repetition of that behavior, impulsivity. In the later stages, compulsive relief of withdrawal symptoms becomes a predominant driver. Physical and/or emotional discomfort is avoided as much as possible. This avoidance causes pleasure. This pleasurable relief from withdrawal symptoms continues to motivate the repetition of that behavior. Addiction has been described as dancing with a 800-pound gorilla. It's exciting at first, impulsive, then it's a habit you do, compulsive, and finally you're exhausted, but you're not done dancing until the gorilla is done dancing. Stress and the role of the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus regulates body temperature, hunger, thirst, sleep, and our response to stress. The hypothalamus signals the pituitary gland to release hormones to the endocrine system, which acts on different parts of the body, not just within the brain as neurotransmitters do. Think of the fight or flight of the autonomic sympathetic nervous system. When you have a tiger in front of you, no bars between you, your heart rate increases, your respirations increase, your blood pressure goes up, and you're ready to boogie out of there. These hormones can also act as neuromodulators within the brain, like a neurotransmitter acts. A medical intuitive, somebody gifted with a sixth sense regarding disease and healing, referred to the hypothalamus as the location of our soul. Stress is a major trigger for relapse. Relapse is a bigger problem than withdrawal for addiction patients. Stress and psychostimulants cross-react with each other, promoting relapse. Psychostimulants, amphetamines, cocaine, methamphetamine, are much more difficult to get off of than other addictive drugs due to this cross-reactivity at the neurotransmitter level. Stress, creating an unfortunate cycle. Efforts to stop using cause stress. Stress triggers a release of the stress hormones from the hypothalamus. Dopamine and serotonin activity in the nucleus accumbens actually decrease with this stress early in recovery. These calming neurotransmitters normally would help reduce the stress. This is a disruption of the normal stress response that occurs with addiction and withdrawal. The dopamine and serotonin neurotransmitters should be increasing to help cope with the stress, but in reality, they decrease, especially with the psychostimulant abuse. Stress triggers addictive behavior, use. Thus, withdrawal causes stress, which can trigger more addictive use, which causes stress to the addict who is unable to stop using the drugs, and a vicious cycle in which the normal calming or breaking serotonin and dopamine activity from the nucleus accumbens is lost. Recovery is the process of breaking this cycle. It takes a lot of motivation. Medications can help, but recovery still requires effort. The brain is very adaptable. It learns. That's what it was designed to do, to learn. Recovery is a process of learning. Learning involves forming new circuits and pathways in the brain. Many recovering addicts testify that the first step effort at recovery is much easier than recovery after numerous slips or relapses. The first is a gift. It's progressively harder to recover after the first attempt. This is one of the spiritual axioms of recovery. Related brain areas and the neurotransmitters and their functions. The negative emotional memory in the amygdala is associated with drug withdrawal. The positive emotional memory in the amygdala is associated with drug cues. Hypothalamic and nucleus accumbens, serotonin, calming, and dopamine feel-good disruption occur to stress or dysregulation. The pleasurable relief from withdrawal symptoms occurs by resuming drug use or addictive activities, reduce stress, and soothe the hypothalamus. Opiates inhibit the firing of neurons in the locus coeruleus. When opiate consumption is stopped, the increased activity of the locus coeruleus contributes to the symptoms of opiate withdrawal. An alpha-2 adrenoceptor agonist called clonidine is used to counteract this withdrawal effect by decreasing adrenergic neurotransmission from the locus coeruleus. Remember, alcoholics and addicts have altered dopamine 2 alleles in the locus coeruleus part of the brain. Why are drugs addictive? The brain makes its own drugs. If you look at this table, there are 3 columns. The left column would be the normal neurotransmitters in the brain. The middle column would be the drugs that mimic those neurotransmitters. And the far right column would be the receptors located in the brain, where they're located. So on the left, you see that endorphins and enkephalins are produced by the brain. They're mimicked by morphine, heroin, the opiates. Receptors are all over the brain. Anandamide is a neurotransmitter that's mimicked by the cannabis, THC, marijuana family. Most of those receptors are in the superior brainstem. Acetylcholine involves the nicotine receptors throughout the entire brain. Dopamine, mimicked by cocaine, amphetamine, methamphetamine. Receptors are mainly in the mesocortical and mesolimbic area. Gamma hydroxybutyrate, GHB, the drug that mimics that would be alcohol and the benzodiazepines, alcohol in tablet form, found throughout the modern and primitive brain areas. Serotonin and glutamate are mimicked by hallucinogens. They're located mainly in the parahippocampus and the cerebral cortex. Drugs hijack the reward system of the brain. Drugs of abuse mimic the brain's own neurotransmitters. They stimulate the brain's receptors in the reward system, causing dopamine release, leading to the artificial high. Occasional use starts the impulsive cycle. It feels good. Let's do it again, teaching the brain to anticipate reward. This leads to the compulsive cycle. Repeated exposure leads to craving, to brain adaptation, neuroplasticity, and repeated use. Neuroplasticity is the physiologic anatomic term of more receptors forming because there's so much drug there, the brain makes more receptors for that excess amount of drug. Neurobehavior change is the behavioral mental health term for what goes on with neuroplasticity. And again, this is basically an increased number of receptors forming for any given drug or neurotransmitter in any specific area of the brain when there's more drug than can occupy the receptors. Those receptors are located all over the brain. There are several different main receptor types. Delta is involved in pain relief. It's an antidepressant, can cause seizures, physical dependence, and decreases breathing. Kappa is involved in pain relief, has anti-seizure effect, can cause depression, disassociation, hallucination, urine flow, dysphoria, making you feel bad, small pupils, has neuroprotective effects, causes sedation, and can cause stress in excess amounts. The mu1 is involved in pain relief and physical dependence. Mu2, respiratory depression, narrowed pupils, feeling good, constipation, physical dependence. The nociception receptor causes anxiety, appetite, depression, development of tolerance to the mu effects. Zeta is involved in embryonic development and regulation of cancer cell proliferation. Cannabinoid system. In the neocortex, the higher cognitive functions of thought, integration of sensory and information. In the cerebellum, it's involved with motor control and coordination. This is where the largest number of endocannabinoid receptors are located in the brain. There are also receptors in the hypothalamus, where it's involved with regulation of appetite, sleep cycle, sexual behavior, reaction to stress, and hormonal levels, the neuroendocrine link. The basal ganglia THC receptors are involved in motor control and coordination. In the ventral striatum, they project into the feelings of reward in the hippocampus and the amygdala. The hippocampus, memory, learning of facts, sequences, and places. The amygdala, anxiety, emotion, fear, paranoia. Excuse me, brainstem and spinal cord, the vomiting reflex and sensation of pain. Acetylcholine has two major types of receptors, nicotinic for nicotine and muscarinic. These receptors are located throughout the brain: the thalamus, deep layers of the cerebral cortex, ventral tegmental area, medial habenula, substantia nigra, and pars compacta. There's an A3 receptor strongly expressed in the locus coeruleus, habenula, and intrapedicular nucleus. Peripheral tissues also have strong concentrations of the A3 receptor in the autonomic and sensory ganglia, and the A4 receptor is quite prevalent in the trigeminal ganglion, which involves the face. Dopamine and norepinephrine system. The mesolimbic system involved with ADD, ADHD, addiction, schizophrenia. The mesocortical system, ADD, ADHD, addiction, schizophrenia. Nigrostriatal area, addiction, chorea, a dancing-like movement, and Parkinson's, another movement disorder disease. And finally, the tuberoinfundibular area of the brain, which is involved in hyperprolactinemia, which often causes nipple discharge. Gamma hydroxybutyrate, the GABA system, has a neuroinhibitory functions. The main areas would be the frontal cortex, memory, emotions, thoughts, cerebral cortex, thought coordination, cerebellum coordination, nucleus accumbens, the reward addiction centers working with dopamine and serotonin, the amygdala involved with emotions, survival instinct, and memory, and the hippocampus. Medication-assisted treatment, MAT. Medications can make addiction treatment easier and more successful for the patient. Medically assisted treatment involves the use of medications to not only help with the detox phase of treatment, but also to help patients have an easier time getting into recovery. Medications and protocols are available for use for abuse and addiction of all the major drug classes: alcohol, amphetamines, benzodiazepines and barbiturates, cocaine, ecstasy, inhalants or huffing, marijuana, methamphetamine, nicotine, and opiates. The best success rate for medication-assisted therapy is with opiates. There is no such thing as a medication to cure addiction. Cure means a one-time treatment producing permanent results, such as with a strep throat. Control means that if the treatment is used, the problem can be controlled. Diabetes, high blood pressure, and others can be controlled but not cured. Treatment to control generally requires periodic monitoring and possible adjustments of dosage, medication, and other factors. Various medications are used to treat addiction to specific substances. There is no one-size-fits-all. Treatment is tailored to an individual patient's need. Dual diagnosis or comorbid conditions also need attention for successful treatment. Most folks use drugs to feel better. Sometimes people are self-treating various forms of mental illness that may have never been diagnosed, much less properly treated. Numerous mental health issues must be addressed for proper addiction treatment. Anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, also known as manic depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, psychological trauma, traumatic disease can be helped with addiction medications. Many of these can be successfully managed. Sometimes other help is needed. Psychology, psychiatry, clergy, family therapy. Although addiction can mimic every form of mental and emotional disease, treating the chemical imbalances caused by these conditions is crucial to attaining meaningful recovery for the patient. Ignoring these comorbid dual diagnosis conditions does a great disservice to the patient. Acupuncture and AcuDetox. This can be quite helpful and has been shown to actually double the success rate for long-term recovery from drug abuse, useful in all the different types of drugs of abuse that there are. Acupuncture is a form of Chinese medicine that's over 5,000 years old. It's still being used simply because it works. The theory behind acupuncture is that there is a flow of qi, the vital life force, in everybody. This energy of life flows through specific channels called meridians. Treatment can be done with beads, seeds, needles with electrical charges applied, and needles with specific Chinese herbs burned. This is called moxibustion. The needles seem to work the best. It's got an amazingly calming effect. Patients describe it as being washed over with a wave of well-being, anything like I've ever felt in my life. It's very common to see people coming in when they're just really, really stressed out. They just need to kill something. They're so stressed out. Put the needles in, check back on them in a little bit, and they're splayed out across the chair with their tongue hanging out looking like roadkill. It's just so amazingly relaxing. People just love it when they come in, and especially when they're in early recovery and they're very stressed and jittery and upset and anxious and have a million problems and their brain can't shut down. To put these needles in, it's pretty much painless to put the needles in. The effect is just nothing short of amazing. Patients love it. They truly do. And again, it does not matter what substance has been abused. It has this calming effect across all the different parts of the brain and all the different substances of abuse. There are 5 acupuncture points in the outer ear that are treated. The Shen Man is called the heavenly gate. This calms the spirit, decreases anxiety, insomnia, and pain. Sympathetic calms the fight or flight response. It's also good for sympathetic nervous system balancing. Kidney deals with emotion and fear. Liver detoxifies, unblocks stuck energy, emotional and physical, especially people with chronic anger issues. It helps that a great deal. Lung also helps us to let go, especially of grief and sadness and anger as well. There's also a point behind the Shen Man on the other side of the ear that's very useful for treating attention deficit hyperactivity disorders. We can treat that. Sometimes we'll even just treat that with a bead taped in place and let the patient leave the office with it. Folks who have trouble focusing and concentrating could just reach up and kind of press on that point with the bead in it when they're feeling like they need to concentrate a little bit better, and it does help. Buprenorphine effects. Consider 6 different colored padlocks: delta, kappa, U1, U2, nociception, and zeta. Each lock has a different function. Agonist agents fit into the lock, turn, open, and activate the lock or receptor. An antagonist fits into the lock but won't turn open or activate the lock or receptor, preventing any other molecule from engaging the receptor, blocking its effect. Buprenorphine is a mixed agonist-antagonist. It's a partial agonist-antagonist at the mu1 that does result in pain relief. It's an antagonist of kappa. It has mixed effects on other receptor subtypes. Norbuprenorphine is a metabolite of buprenorphine that does have psychotropic properties. It blocks the mu2 receptor. There's no euphoria, no high. It actually blocks people from getting high. Eight milligrams of sublingual buprenorphine will give an 86% receptor blockade in opiate-tolerant dependent users. 16 milligrams under the tongue will cause a 94% blockade. 24 milligrams will cause a 97% blockade. This is the Suboxone or Subutex brand that comes in 8 milligram doses, 1, 2, or 3 tablets. The brain can tell the difference between 8 and 16 milligrams, 86% to 94%, or an 8% difference in receptor blockade. The brain cannot tell the difference between 16 milligrams and 24 milligrams, otherwise a 94 to 97% or only 3% blockade difference. However, 24 milligrams can be used short-term for acute pain syndromes if needed, such as after surgery. Remember, buprenorphine blocks the euphoric effect of opiates. They sure don't make heroin like they used to. Buprenorphine relieves and prevents craving, stops pain. It's actually used in open heart surgery for pain control. The receptor half-life is 30 hours. Plasma half-life is 3 to 5 hours, but it has a very high affinity for the receptor, which causes a much longer half-life. After the 16 milligram dose in 30 hours, 8 milligrams is still working. 30 more hours, 4 milligrams is still working. This is what a half-life means. This strong affinity for the mu2 receptor means that the bup receptor bond at the mu2 receptor is about 500 times stronger than the receptor's affinity for morphine. This means that a much longer time is necessary before the buprenorphine will randomly bounce off the receptor than morphine or heroin would. It should be noted that molecules and atoms sort of bounce around and have energy. They will eventually leave the receptor. The stronger the affinity the receptor and molecule bond is, the longer that receptor will be occupied by a given agent. This explains why having used bup will ruin attempts to get high by using heroin for more than a day after the last full therapeutic dose of buprenorphine has been taken. Transitioning from methadone to buprenorphine deserves special mention and review. Many methadone clinics put their patients on high doses of methadone, whether they need it or not, to control their addiction and/or pain. The best way to convert a patient from methadone to buprenorphine is to start when the patient's down to about 30 milligrams of methadone a day. The patient may need to be slowly titrated down to this level. It may take many weeks to do so. Methadone has a very prolonged and variable half-life of 8 to 60 hours. It's metabolized in the liver by the cytochrome P450 CYP-3A4 subreceptor types. It's metabolized by the same liver enzymes as methadone and buprenorphine. Converting the patients from daily methadone doses above 30 milligrams is possible, but the patient will be uncomfortable. This is unavoidable. Due to the long half-life of methadone in the body, it must be stopped for 2 days before bup could be initiated. Even then, there will probably be some opiate withdrawal symptoms. Medications are prescribed to ease the various withdrawal symptoms that will be expected. Buprenorphine treatment should be started when the patient is in early or mild opiate withdrawal. Starting this medication while the patient has high level of other opiates, pain pills, heroin, methadone, can trigger opiate withdrawal or cold turkey type symptoms. Buprenorphine is not absorbed in the gut. It works well transmucosally across moist surfaces such as the inside of the mouth. It is best dissolved in the mouth, held in the mouth, with the saliva being not swallowed but swished around in the mouth, using the tongue to sort of paint the surfaces of the mouth, the cheek, tongue, under the tongue, gums, etc. Try to keep the drug-containing saliva in the mouth for at least 15 minutes. Do not smoke cigarettes or anything else before taking the medication and for as long as possible after the medication. Avoid brushing teeth before medicating and for as long as possible after medicating. Some toothpastes contain astringents, which can lessen the absorption of the drug. To give an idea of the different forms, Subutex is pure buprenorphine. It's available generic right now. Our retail cost would be about $4.50 a tablet. On the street, that would go for $25 to $40. Suboxone is the same medication, but with the addition of naloxone, which is an opiate blocker, which means it cannot be snorted or injected. This is the preferred medication type. It tastes a little bit better. And most clinics use this instead of the pure Subutex or buprenorphine. Cost is about $7.73, $20 to $25 on the street. Suboxone also comes in a film preparation. There's Zubsolv, which has a slightly different dose. It's absorbed a little bit better, and that's why it has the lower dose. It's a bit more expensive. Then Bunavail is also usually a little bit more expensive, not quite as much as the Zubsolv, and has a much lower abuse potential. As far as Medicaid is concerned, Suboxone film is their preferred agent at this time. Buprenorphine effects. Naloxone is a drug that's used to counter the agents, the opiate agents. It blocks all opiate activity. This is especially useful in overdose when breathing stops. It can restore breathing, blood pressure, etc. The Evzio autoinjector is available at about $3,742 per dose. Narcan in a vial would be available for about $65 a dose. The Evzio injector, however, is available on a compassionate use protocol. Most insurances will pick up the tab, and there are a variety of different types of programs by the company that makes this medication to make it available at a much lower dose. Neuroplasticity. Drugs work on specific receptors. The neurons that fire together wire together and form stronger linkages. There are many different types of neurotransmitters which have different types of effects. Glutamate is generally excitatory. Glutamine is generally inhibitory. Gamma-aminobutyric acid, or GABA, tends to calm and inhibit. Serotonin also has a calming and inhibiting effect. Norepinephrine is excitatory. Dopamine is known as the feel-good neurotransmitter. Prolactin is the in-love transmitter. It's what's released when people fall in love. Endorphins are also mimicked by morphine and other opiates. They are naturally present in the body to relieve pain and other brain functions. There are many other neurotransmitters that exist. We still don't know all of them, but research continues. When there is an excess amount of activity of a neurotransmitter or drug, as in the addiction or a routine heavy user, the brain can respond by increasing the number of chemical receptors, e.g. on the next neurons, so that the excess amount of drug or neurotransmitter will have receptors to occupy while leaving some receptors empty to restore the normal tone of the brain and the neurons in the presence of that excessive amount of the drug or neurotransmitter. This is a natural compensatory homeostatic mechanism. This causes tolerance, the situation where the same dose of the drug has less of an effect, such that more drug is needed to maintain the desired effect. The opposite condition also occurs. If one has been a heavy user and suddenly stops, symptoms of drug withdrawal can happen. At the cell membrane, what is happening is that there are now many empty unoccupied receptors on the next neuron. This alters the normal function of that neuron. Under conditions in which it would normally fire or trigger an electrical impulse, it may remain silent, or under conditions in which it would normally be quiet, it may start sending false signals. The withdrawal symptoms are specific to each of the various drug types used. Detoxification. Withdrawal is never a pleasant process. It can kill as well. A brief review is in order. Alcohol withdrawal can be lethal. It needs to be done under medical supervision. Amphetamine withdrawal symptoms, people are typically sleepy, tired, irritable. Barbiturate withdrawal also could be lethal. Needs to be done under medical supervision, as does benzodiazepine withdrawal. Cocaine withdrawal typically causes irritability and fatigue. Marijuana does not have a significant withdrawal syndrome. The drug is stored in fat. We talked earlier about distribution. Distribution means where the drug goes in the body, and marijuana is very likely to end up in fat cells where it stays for a long period of time and will leach out slowly over time, forming a sort of an auto detox. Opiate withdrawal, dancing with the cold turkey, the shakes, the sweats, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, tremors, yawning, runny nose. You may feel like you'll have to get better to die. You wish you would die, but it's actually very safe and you won't die from opiate withdrawal. You'll just wish you could. Neuroplasticity is the term that describes both situations above. Too many or too few receptors for any given condition. This is how the brain adapts to try to maintain homeostasis, a desirable steady state or normalcy of sorts.